Welcome into the Fireside Bears YouTube channel. You can follow us on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at Fireside Bears. You can follow myself and my co-host Max Smith on Twitter at Usayd and at Max Smith ESM. Max, how you doing? The Bears officially hired Matt Eberflus this morning around 10 a.m. Central Time. The news broke, but what's up, man?
Not much. Just excited. This is a really big day, new era, completely in Chicago Bears football. My boss, I don't live in Illinois. I'm outside of Illinois, but it's funny that the company president is actually a Bears fan that I go to work at. And we've had multiple lunches where we were discussing this entire process where who do we think is going to be the next head coach, or who do we want to be the next head coach? So the fact that I got an email halfway in the middle of a meeting from him saying Eberflus ? Was fun. So this isn't a unifying rallying call for the base, but you know what? I'm going to preview this conversation. I'm going to say it was the right one. So I'm pretty good.
I'm doing well also, and I think the previews we've done with the Hunt at Hallis series have kind of signaled and leaned towards, talking about for and against every single head coaching candidate. And, for someone and I always say this on every single podcast when these decisions break or every single YouTube show that we do, but for someone who's as plugged into the Bears as I am, I think that this is a decision that kind of was in place late last night. It's something that you look at and it kind of came down to, is it going to be Dan Quinn or is it going to be Jim Caldwell? I know that reports came out today saying that George Poley wanted to have Jim Caldwell in the building as the next head coach, but Ryan Poles kind of went ahead and said, hey, no, we're not going to go Jim Caldwell. We are hiring Matt Eberflus as the next head coach. Sorry, these names, Matt and Ryan, going from Matt Nagy and Ryan Pace to Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus. Right. It's going to take a lot of getting used to. But anyways, I think that, what the Bears are kind of betting on with this hire is they want someone that's a defensive mind, but that's also a leader of men. Now, ultimately, when we look at Eberflus, we have to understand something. We have to understand that compared to the last I want to say 2 times, the Bears went ahead and hired a head coach, which is John Fox and Matt Nagy, by the way. Those head coaches did not have interviews the prior year to getting hired. Okay. And that's something that's different about Matt Eberflus is he's been a coordinator, and you know what? He had interviews in 2021. And then again, he got them one more time in 2022. And now it's been, hey, you're finally getting a head coaching gig that you like, but you've also earned, and again, I want to talk about the interview process because when the Bears hired Matt Nagy, in 2018, 2016, 2017, the name Matt Nagy was really tossed around NFL circles. We're seeing this is a massive step up in the sense that the Bears went out and that they hired Eberflus. And ultimately what it did is they hired someone that's clearly been a hot commodity around the league, but has not wanted to leave Indianapolis until he kind of finds the right situation.
Yeah, Eberflus, we could just call him Flus. That's what the Colts called him. That's what we're going to start calling him now too, Coach Flus. The Flus is loose. Eberflus is an interesting guy, and absolutely correct. He is 100% deserving of a head coaching position in the NFL simply because of what he's been able to do with what he's been given, right? If you go back and watch, this is a note to myself, put the card right here. If you go back and watch our breakdown of Matt Eberflus, we both just had nothing to say, but this guy doesn't have first-round draft capital surrounding him. He doesn't have the hottest free agents surrounding him in Indianapolis, but he's able to put a consistent league-leading defense on the field, and he's able to win games through his defense, right? Which is amazing. Frank Reich didn't originally plan on coaching the Colts. He didn't choose Eberflus. Eberflus was there when Frank Reich got there. So the fact that Frank Reich was able to trust him and keep him on and want to keep him on for that long tells you just how much, like you just said, a commodity this guy is, right? And a lot of people are comparing this to, another Matt Nagy, where this guy hasn't been a head coach before. Yeah, who is really good at this position. Well, no, completely not the same. And here's why. Eberflus has been in his position longer than Matt Nagy was, number one. And number two, Eberflus has been in more teams and in more like successful teams than Matt Nagy was, number two. And number three, Eberflus just seems to get it, right? He seems to be more of the hardworking guy. Players seem to just like him more. The guy just seems to be more responsive in the locker room. This is a home run, in my opinion. And when I look back and when I remember recording that video and I was talking to myself about Eberflus, the more I talked about it, the more it got me excited, because this is really a guy that's going to come in and just get everybody pumped, right? He's kind of I wouldn't say he's a no-nonsense guy. If you watch any of the Hard Knocks, he likes to joke around with the players, right? But he's incredibly dedicated to his craft. He's dedicated to the game, and he's the kind of guy that's going to tell you you can't cheat the game of football, right? You know, numbers don't lie. That's the kind of guy that he is, and that's going to do wonders for this team, not only on the defensive side of the ball, but on the offense. But a lot of the criticism of us bringing in a defensive coordinator when this team is clearly set up for an offensive future is 100% warranted. I am right there with you. But what it tells us is he has a plan for offensive coordinator that's strong enough that Ryan Poles and ownership agree on. He has a plan for who he's going to bring in that Ryan Poles approved in his interview and said, I like this guy's plan more than anyone else's. We need to sign him right now, or he might go to Jacksonville, right? Of all places. We need to bring him to Chicago. He's going to bring us into the future. And I completely agree. Out of Caldwell and Dan Quinn, which I have no ill fortune towards any of them, for me, it was Eberflus, Caldwell, Quinn. I just don't want to see Dan Quinn in Chicago. I just have huge reservations about him. I'm sure, you know, I don't know. Call me skeptical. Just don't love his head coaching record. Love his defensive coaching record. Absolute stud, right? Caldwell, fantastic. I'd love to see him on the Bears staff. Seriously, I think he'd be fantastic for Justin Fields in this offense. I really do. But at the end of the day, Ryan Poles said, this is the guy I want. And it's probably because Eberflus just had the best argument for what he can do with this team and what he wants to do with Justin Fields and who he's going to bring in to make sure that it happens.
Listen, I'm done with this whole notion of let's hire a defensive-minded head coach, but you know what? Or let's not hire one. I want to say something real quick, by the way, before I really lay into why Matt Eberflus was kind of hired. When you ultimately look at the Bears, right, you have to understand something, is that Ryan Poles comes from Kansas City. Some guy by the name of Dave Borgonzi, who just so happens to be on the Colts defensive staff as a linebackers coach, is a colleague of Matt Eberflus. And if you recognize the name Dave Borgonzi or the last name Borgonzi, you know that the director of football operations in Kansas City is also Mike Borgonzi, who's a colleague of Ryan Poles, or a former colleague, I should say. And so in a way, this is a decision that when we talk about stuff like familiarity, ultimately the Bears and Ryan Poles decided, hey, listen, we are going to go with somebody that we have a bit more intel on. And I certainly think it's possible that Ryan Poles went to Mike Borgonzi and was just like, hey, do you have any extra intel on Matt Eberflus? I guarantee you all that happened. But you know what? When we talk about the guy above my head, Justin Fields, I need to say something. Hiring an offensive-minded coach may be popular and convenient in today's NFL, but in life, guess what? What's popular isn't always right, and what's right isn't always popular. What the Bears really wanted was a leader of men, and Matt Eberflus has shown time and time again that he's exactly a leader of men. He's someone that knows the X's and O's. You talk about that Colts defense. Since Eberflus has been there in 2018, let me give you all a basic statistic. They've drafted one player in the first round, and even that was in 2021, defensive end Kwity Paye from Michigan. You talk about the other players on that team, Julian Blackmon, day 2 or day 3 pick. Darius Leonard, second round pick. Majority of those cornerbacks, you know what? And defensive backs, those were all day 2, day 3 draft picks. The only other first-round draft pick on that roster is DeForest Buckner, but even DeForest Buckner on the defensive side of the ball, to clarify, is a player that was drafted by the San Francisco 49ers. And so, in essence, Matt Eberflus has shown time and time again, hey, listen, you know what? I don't care where you're drafted. I'm going to draft you. I'm going to develop you. You are going to be a starter on the defensive side of the ball. Now, What cost does that come at? The cost that it comes at is this: is that Eberflus's biggest decision is not going to be switching the Bears from a 3-4 to a 4-3, which, by the way, I should mention, the transition is going to be very easy considering the size the Bears have on the defensive line. We will get to that in just a minute here. The big decision Eberflus is going to have to make that's ultimately going to define his tenure in Chicago is who does he bring in at offensive coordinator? Who does he bring in at quarterbacks coach? What is the offensive staff that he's going to go ahead and develop? Who's going to be the play caller? Certainly, those are the decisions that are going to need to be made. When you talk about the Bears, you know what? I seriously think that someone such as a Press Taylor, who's working or is currently with the Indianapolis Colts, he would make sense. I know we saw Kevin Patullo get thrown out there as a name just because Patullo is currently the Eagles offensive coordinator and he was with the Indianapolis Colts in 2018, 19, and 20, kind of working as a wide receivers coach and a pass game coordinator. Ultimately, you know what? I think the Bears need to have, and Eberflus especially, to really put a stamp on Chicago over the next few years. He needs to have a home run hire of an offensive coordinator. I would even throw Mike McDaniel out there as a possibility from the Kyle Shanahan coaching tree.
Yeah, we know that on Colin Cowherd today, Albert Breer said that Eberflus would be looking towards the Mike Shanahan tree for potential offensive coordinator. So he's going to go pick an apple from that tree and say, hey, would you like the OC for the Chicago Bears, right? We don't know who that is. We can have a couple of ideas. There's names like Mike McDaniels or O'Connell or Clint Kubiak out of Minnesota, right? There's a bunch of different names that we potentially throw around, but regardless of the names, right? And here's the thing that we get caught up so often in is we never really know until we know, right? And that's what's huge is we're going to keep using this for as long as I live. Is Matt Nagy was a brand new Maserati and it ended up being a complete and total lemon, right? We don't know until we totally know. So for any of these OCs, we can speculate as much as we want, and we can want the guy that we want. But at the end of the day, we're just going to have to wait and see if it's a good decision or not, even with Eberflus, right? But here's a little caveat with Eberflus, and this is what I think was smart from the front office, is this guy is going to have one half of the ball succeed, without a doubt. The Chicago Bears will win games with Matt Eberflus. I have no question in my mind. Like, we will win games. At least we'll be a 500 team still. There's no question in my mind. I don't think we're going to have a John Fox era where we're the laughingstock of the NFL for a few years. No, I don't think that's going to happen. But here's the kicker is they're setting up, and I think that they're doing this on purpose because they really believe in Justin Fields. They're setting up a revolving door at offensive coordinator. The concept is you bring a guy in who wants to be a head coach. He does really well for a few seasons, maybe 1 to 2, Brian Daboll-esque, Brian Leftwich-esque. Give them a couple seasons to win games, go to the playoffs, do well, have a stud QB that they're able to put on the resume and say, hey, look, I was able to do this with Justin Fields and Chicago Bears. Why don't you bring me on to your developing franchise and I'll help you get to the same spot that the Bears were a year ago? I think that's exactly what's happening here. And I think that it was incredibly smart from the front office to do this because if you get the rock steady kind of personality guy that Eberflus is, who's the hard hat guy, who believes in the culture, believes in locker rooms, believes in players' attitudes towards coaching staff, believes in all the things that we love to hear. Guys like a total perfect player guy. Love it. That's perfect because you have that consistency from the top that we didn't have in the past 3 years. So if we have the consistency from the top with Eberflus, the guy can come in underneath and go, okay, Justin, okay, Bears, let's do this. Let's figure this out. I'm probably not going to be here for a long time, but I'm going to do the most that I can while I'm here. So Eberflus is going to stay here while we can have a revolving door at the OC, and we're going to keep winning games. Like, that's the ideal scenario here, right? But even if that doesn't pan out, the Bears are still going to win games. The Bears are still going to be a pretty solid team with the core that we have right now. I just don't see any downside to Eberflus, and I don't understand why people do. I mean, like, do you see any potential downside here?
I mean, I think the only potential downside is that we're kind of faced with what we've seen in the past time and time again, where it's like, okay, you hire a defensive minded guy, defense is really good, but then all of a sudden you just can't figure out how to put the offense together. And that's really, I think, going to be the defining points in the Eberflus tenure here in Chicago. You know, the Bears are basically saying, hey, listen, Ryan Poles, you have to understand something. Look, take a step back for a second. there's a report that came out from the Bears blog, who a lot of people have beefs with. I don't have any beef with Jeff, by the way, because he's got good information. And in this industry, guess what? Your network, your connections, your sources, they matter. Okay. When you look at Ryan Poles, we said this earlier in the show. George McCaskey, Bill Polian wanted Jim Caldwell. Ryan Poles said, absolutely not. I'm going in a different direction. This is going to be my head coach hire. Now, what that basically does is this: it sends a message to your search committee as well as your ownership group that this is the head coach that I'm tying my hip to, and that's Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus. So this is no longer a Ryan Pace, John Fox situation. Okay. Had Jim Caldwell been hired, it would have been another Pace Fox situation. This is not that in any way, shape, or form. And so ultimately, Poles has linked himself to Matt Eberflus for the next couple of years. It could be 3 to 5 years, whatever the case may be. Now, what's going to need to happen is this: is the only downside is that, all right, like I said, the offense is really bad and the defense is really good. In a league where offense continues to rule, the Bears have to understand something: is that they're going to have to poach from the defense to add to the offense. That means it's going to be addition by subtraction. Okay. And Ryan Poles and Eberflus are really going to have to understand this. Eberflus is going to need to understand that, listen, there's going to be times and years where spending a first round pick on a defensive player when there's a far more important need for your quarterback is what will need to happen. And I think philosophically, when you look at Poles and Eberflus, there's something very interesting that needs to be said for both of these guys. Poles comes from Kansas City, which is an organization that has shown and is willing to kind of be aggressive and constantly add to the offensive side of the ball. Eberflus comes from an organization where under Chris Ballard, and Frank Reich kind of signs off on this stuff too, they're content with just sitting on their hands and letting things play out. Now, there's advantages to both of what Poles and Eberflus's previous organizations have done. But what will need to happen is this: is that they're going to have to align on how they want to build the Bears moving forward. Because again, there are some pieces in place, but not every piece is in place. But one thing that's absolutely critical is that oftentimes what happens is when a defensive minded head coach gets hired, they want to continue adding to the defense because they believe that defense wins championships. And while defense does win championships, because you need to have a defense to win a championship, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers showcased us that last year because they absolutely destroyed Patrick Mahomes in the Super Bowl. Ultimately, at the end of the day, listen, the Bears are going to have to add to the offense at the expense of the defense. And for the Bears, you know what? Before the defense is truly elite again, it might be 2 to 3 seasons. Now, when you talk about the defensive side of the ball, the Bears have run a 3-4 since 2015. They're switching back to the old 4-3, which means 4 down linemen, 3 linebackers. And then what's going to need to happen is this: is Robert Quinn and Khalil Mack are going to have an opportunity to get their hand in the dirt. You might also go ahead and see players such as Roquan Smith completely shift roles and have to play a will linebacker position because there's going to be an entirely different defensive package. Now, here's the thing. Typically, before I end my rant, what happens is this: is teams who switch from a 3-4 to a 4-3 or 4-3 to 3-4, vice versa, whatever the case may be, they take 2 to 3 years to have to overhaul everything. It's the exact reason as to why when the Bears hired Mel Tucker, and Mark Trestman, they basically told Mel Tucker, hey, you go ahead and you can have this job, but you're going to have to run a 4-3 defense. There's 2 problems there. Number one, Mel Tucker's a 3-4 guy. All right. So you can't make the personnel work, but when you have the right talent and the right coaching, things can adjust. And number 2, you know what? You need to have the right players. You need to know the terminology. Okay. Matt Eberflus has shown that he can do both of those things, kind of consistently adjust and adapt. He's very similar to Lovie Smith in the sense that it's just hustle, play with a high motor, get after the guy who has the ball. That's why you see 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people going after one ball carrier because there's a relentless pursuit, which, by the way, don't even worry about Roquan Smith's fit because as speedy as Roquan Smith is, he's already everywhere on the field, and in a system that requires him to be everywhere the ball is, he's going to be fine.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like let's look at this 4-3 defense because there's a bunch of questions. One from the top is where is Sean Desai going to end up? Is he still going to be the DC at the end of the day? Because Eberflus isn't probably going to let up reins of the defense because that's his stuff. This is his baby. Who knows what's going to happen there? But when we look at a pure personnel aspect, what I think is really interesting when we're looking at Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus is both come from organizations that prioritize the draft, right? Both are from organizations that look to develop talent from within instead of consistently looking outside of the market to bring chips in. Now, the Chiefs do that. They look outside to bring chips in. And of course, the Colts brought in Phillip Rivers and Carson Wentz. But primarily, these are teams that are built through the draft and built through their internal talent. The Bears have done that pretty successfully towards the latter half of Ryan Pace's regime. And I think that that's a page that's going to continue on in this new era of Poles and Flus football. I want to say Matt and Ryan again, but that'd be confusing. So what I think between the two, I think that's kind of a commonality is that Eberflus is a big guy on development, right? And Poles is really good at determining exactly what a team needs to succeed. For Kansas City, it was let's build the trench around Patrick Mahomes and let's get him weapons that'll allow him to succeed. In Chicago, it's let's build the trench around Justin Fields and let's get him the weapons to succeed. For the defense side of the ball, it's 4-3. So now we need to answer the question, will Bilal Nichols and Eddie Goldman come back and play to the level that they can? And will they fill out that 3-tech? Because that's absolutely crucial in this type of defense. Second question is who's going to step up as that secure slot corner? Because that's absolutely crucial in this type of defense. Are we going to move Jalen Johnson to the slot? Is that something he can do? Another question that's going around is absolutely. Roquan Smith is the perfect size for a will linebacker, which is the weak side backer in a 4-3. Absolutely perfect. His sideline to sideline speed is insane. The only issue is maybe his willingness to attack the gap, but I think he can do it under the right direction. Darius Leonard was exactly what Roquan Smith could be to Eberflus's continuation of his 4-3 defense. Another question is Eddie Jackson. Will he become what we knew him as with Eberflus back in charge? You know, I don't think he's had a free safety with the amount of talent that Jackson has. You know, I don't know if he's had that, or I've seen Colts defense have some sort of. Obviously, they have a great secondary, but again, it's how he was able to come in and kind of mold and shape that. And if you've seen clips with him, he's working with the D-backs, he's working with the linebackers, he's working with the linemen. Right? There's not a single piece of the defense that he's not coaching and helping to improve. So that's really exciting. But when we look at some of the holes in this 4-3 is we don't know who the Mike's going to be. Who's going to be the middle linebacker? Eberflus's defense is very bread and butter for Chicago Bears fans, and it should be something that we should be familiar with, kind of looking back on the golden days of Rod Marinelli and Lovie Smith, right? Both of these guys ran incredibly similar defenses, and they're centered around a super big, strong, hard-nosed Mike middle linebacker, right? We don't have one of those right now. Our defense is a little small in the secondary, small at the linebacker position, but big up front. So we need to look in the draft. We need to look at a really solid middle linebacker prospect, or we need to go into the free agency and bring one in, right? A 6'6" or 6'3" guy, 6'4" guy, a little 240 to 250 pounds, just a big body that's able to attack the gaps incredibly strong. That's something that we're missing on this defense. And we have some question marks around the 3-tech on the inside of the defensive line. So these are questions that Ryan Poles and Eberflus are going to look at when it's draft time, which is coming up pretty soon. We're almost at the NFC AFC championship game. So these are definite questions that we need to start asking as fans, and we need to start looking at the tape. The last thing I want to say on the defense changing over is really how exciting it's going to be to see Khalil Mack back as a defensive end, and how exciting it is to see Robert Quinn back with his hand in the dirt, right? Robert Quinn kind of said the reason his first-year production was so bad was, one, because of his injuries, but two, because he's never played outside linebacker before, right? It'll be really nice to know that these guys don't have to drop back into coverage anymore, and they can just do what they do best and get after the quarterback, which is exactly what we need with these guys, because this team can do incredibly well in a 4-3. They can. We're just missing a few pieces. But the foundation of we need a really solid front four, because remember, there's not a lot of blitzing in these types of defenses. And Eberflus is kind of known. Colts fans don't like Eberflus because he doesn't blitz a lot. It's not very flashy. But the whole idea is your front four is going to make the quarterback's life a living hell. So why should I blitz? Because I need my guys in protection. I need my guys in zone, right? So this defense is built perfectly for it. We just need a few pieces. And, of course, we'll do a bunch of scouting content to make sure that we can find those pieces.
And anyways, we're going to break the Colts defense down for you heavily, as well as during the slower parts of the offseason, including possibly even looking at the rise of a Darius Leonard, who, gets more respect than Roquan Smith for whatever reason. Probably because he has a lot of impact plays. But, I want to touch on something because you mentioned on Khalil Mack having his hand in the dirt. There were 3 years in Oakland, 2015, 16, and 17, where he played with his hand in the dirt. And he had 15, 11, and 10 and a half sacks, including an All-Pro and a Defensive Player of the Year award. So when we look at a guy like Khalil Mack, who's about 6'3", 267 pounds, the last couple of years, basically, he's had to play as a left outside linebacker. The thing with Khalil Mack as well as Robert Quinn is these guys have shown time and time again, hey, we can stand up and play, or we could go ahead and we could stick our hand in the dirt and be completely fine. Okay. When you talk about that defensive line, 4-3 systems are typically one gap system. I'm sorry, they're two gap systems. Okay. And 3-4 defensive ends and defensive linemen are typically bigger. 4-3, your defensive linemen are smaller. But what's going to happen is two things are going to happen this offseason. Number one, the Bears are going to go ahead and they're going to invest in the defensive line because you need to have 2 defensive ends and 2 defensive tackles, which, by the way, Bilal Nichols and Eddie Goldman are already defensive tackles. Bilal Nichols, the Bears tried to make him a defensive end, okay? But at Delaware, he was a defensive tackle, all right? So Khalil Mack as well as Robert Quinn are going to be your defensive ends. Goldman, Nichols going to be your defensive tackles, maybe even Kyrus Tonga. And then your 3 linebackers are going to be 2 pass rushers or 2 outside linebackers that are going to be in coverage and a middle linebacker. Now, Roquan Smith has shown time and time again he can be really good in coverage. Okay, and then maybe a guy like a Travis Gibson or a Charles Snowden. They get enough development and they step up and have the opportunity to hold down those outside linebacker spots. I do not see someone such as Jeremiah Tachu even coming back. And then the Bears are going to have to go out and look to free agency to kind of fill out those roles. Jalen Johnson and Eddie Jackson are both interesting because I think that when you have that added presence in coverage from the linebacker positions, it's going to make the job of the secondary a bit easier. But if there's one name I'm looking for Eberflus to really develop, well, 2 names really, it should be that Eberflus is going to significantly develop. It's going to be Thomas Graham Jr. and Jalen Johnson. I think the Bears have their cornerback duo of the future. And knowing what Eberflus has done in the past with defensive backs, it would not surprise me to see Johnson as well as Graham Jr. have breakout seasons in 2022.
Yeah, that and more. And, I think a guy with a big question mark around is Kendall Builder. Is this a guy that Eberflus thinks deserves to stick around? Because I'm sure he's doing a lot of review. I'm sure he's looking at the roster right now and already marking who he thinks deserves to be on or who he wants to get a better look at come training camp to see who should make the roster. But that's a big question. And I think, there's a lot of focuses on this defense from eyes around the league because there's a lot of question marks here. And typically Bears defense has always been, pretty much rock solid. There's not a lot of questions that we have about it in the offseason. This year, I think we're being a little too optimistic about the direction of this defense. It's an aging core with an absolute bare bones skeleton of a secondary and a lot of questions at the linebacker position outside of Roquan Smith. So I think bringing in a guy like Eberflus to really help bolster defense while also bringing in a guy like Ryan Pauls, who has more of an offensive side, mind. He just does. I think that's going to be super helpful. Maybe reversing the script here. Instead of an offensive coach and a defensive GM, you bring in the offensive GM and the defensive coach who can bring in offensive guys around him to help develop that offensive side of the ball. And I just think we need to be like a little more realistic here in looking at, well, where's the direction of this defense? Who exactly is going to be able to produce at a level that we want them to produce. And come free agency, I'm sure there's going to be a heightened focus on defensive players. And even in the draft, I feel like there's going to be a good amount of draft capital spent on defense. But I don't want fans who immediately throw their arms up in the air and go, well, we're abandoning our offense. We're abandoning our offense. Like no, let's be honest, guys. We spent a lot of draft capital and a lot of free agency dollars recently on the offensive side of the ball, and we have a pretty solid core. Sure, there's a couple of gaps here and there, but there's a lot more gaps in the defense. And if we want to win games consecutively, and if we want to be an elite team in this league, we can't have a lot of gaps on the defense and a little gaps on the offense. We need, a little gaps here and there altogether. So we need to really put more focus on the defensive gaps and just bring in guys that can use what we have offensively already. It's just, I don't understand it.
Yeah, and last point I'll make here is just the fact that I think one of the big things to kind of rely on in 2022 and watch for is, as the Bears continue this development of Justin Fields, can the horses that are already present on defense kind of hold the fort down and the offense see steady incremental improvement? Because the last couple of years were kind of the defense holding the fort down, the offense showing no improvement. This year, though, I think you're going to begin to see that transition where you're going to see the offense continue to improve as the defense holds the fort down. And eventually what it's going to develop into, as the Bears continue to go ahead and power up and invest on the offensive side of the football, and the offense takes another step forward, it's going to buy the buy the coaching staff and Poles time to go ahead and bring in a true 4-3 defense.
Yeah, and I think also what we need to remember is Eberflus's defenses are historically known for takeaways, right? It's just the truth. If you look at statistics over his entire coaching career, his linebackers up to the Colts have just been really well at taking the ball away and creating plays for the offense. So, that addition by subtraction approach where your defense is putting your offense in opportunities to score is never a bad thing. It's never a bad thing. We just need to have an offense that's efficient enough to actually put the ball in the end zone when the defense makes opportunities for us. Something a little bit more than what we saw in 2018, because, Vic Fangio's defense was putting us in opportunities to put the ball in the end zone. Just wasn't a lot of times we were actually putting that ball in the end zone. So if we're able to fine tune that, we're looking at a really good team here. And that's why I very affirmative in the conclusion. Eberflus was the right pick out of the three guys. All in all, very happy with the hire. See little to no reasons to be angry about it. And I'm excited to see what he brings on to fill out the offensive side of staff.
Yeah, absolutely. I am too. Anyways, guys, we're going to get out of this thing. Make sure you're following us on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at FireSideBears. Make sure you're following myself and Max on Twitter at MaxSmithESM and at Usayd Koshal. Yeah, it's been busy. So this week, thanks for bearing with us because we've done a couple shows. As the offseason kind of continues to heat up, we're going to be bringing back the top of the class series. We're going to have a couple new series as well. Some guests on talking Senior Bowl stuff with us. So that's going to do it from us, guys. But make sure you like, comment, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow us on every single social media platform. Follow us wherever, guys. Because we're going to be full steam ahead this off season covering the Bears. It's going to be nonstop, I promise. But good morning, good evening, and good night wherever you may be. Stay safe, stay warm if you're in a cold area. But also bear down, ladies and gentlemen. We'll catch you guys next week.